So, welcome to the show. Today with us, Noah Healy. So, tell us something about yourself.
Well, I'm a recreational mathematician that discovered a better way to do price discovery for commodity markets, and I'm currently engaged in a lawsuit with the U.S. Patent Office over the patent and also their fairly egregious violations of their own procedure. That's what I'm up to these days.
Okay. So, battling the state. That's the patent from 2016 that you filed. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. Just yesterday, in fact, the counsel for the patent office sent me the draft appendix, which is a 27 megabyte record of all of the communications between me and the patent office. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but Google, in an attempt to commercialize Gemini, I suppose, has created something they call Notebook LM, which is a Gemini-powered thing that you can drop resources into, and it will create things like timelines and study guides and stuff like that. So just on a whim, because I just learned about Notebook, I decided to drop it in, and Google actually identified one of the critical points. So I got an acceptance in 2020, which they subsequently ignored, which there's not a procedure for them to, there's a procedure to withdraw it. And the acceptance that I got in 2022, they withdrew that acceptance 3 weeks later. They never withdrew the one from 2020. So when you show Google the entire thing and give it the timeline, they say that the patent was granted in 2020. And then when the 2021 and 2022 and the rest stuff starts coming up, they're like, well, something went wrong. They have all these question marks on it. Like somehow something happened. We don't know what's going on here or why it's happening. But like apparently the patent that was granted is now being re-examined. Of course, sadly, the patent actually wasn't ever granted. They just broke their own rules. And since then, they've been pretty much coming up with more and more pathetic lies for whatever it is they're actually doing. And so now I'm going to talk to a judge about it eventually, or at least write it up for a judge to look at.
Yeah, these patent rules are getting more and more complicated. It seems you already need an expert just to file it or to protect it, and then to battle the government offices and patent
Yeah,
offices.
it's IP is becoming an increasingly thorny issue, not least because many of the assumptions that were built into IP in the first place have actually been falsified by math and physics in the 20th century. So the separation between information and physical systems isn't a real thing. And we have people like Stephen Hawking point that out to us. He actually, I think he lost his bet on the black hole information thing, but current quantum physics effectively physicalizes information as a necessary quality of how our universe functions.
Yeah, well, I think some even argue that the whole patent system, the whole intellectual property system, is actually working in disadvantage to the whole discovery process and scientific discovery and innovations. But on the other hand, there's huge amounts of money being thrown from the huge companies into some research. So it's hard to
Yes.
be
I think
fair
it's
to both
not
parties.
at all unlikely that the patent system is actually detrimental now. And one of the options they plan to explicitly outline is how you can use something called the Curry-Howard isomorphism or Curry-Howard correspondence to point out that under our present understanding of patents simply are not grantable for anything. And that's an argument that's been going on in sort of computer science and philosophy for about as long as I've been alive, actually. I'm going to present those arguments for what, from what I can tell, will be the first time.
Are you talking about the premise that nothing new is to be invented because everything is just a moderation of something that's already been discovered, or something else?
No.
I don't know that.
It's a vastly deeper idea than that. So
Yeah.
Haskell Curry sort of gets the first dibs at this, and he actually demonstrated this a couple of years before Alan Turing wrote his famous paper sort of introducing general computation. But Curry and Howard semi-independently discovered that there's a one-to-one correspondence between all programs, which are also any information system is in fact a valid program, and mathematical proofs. So your car or actually proves some valid mathematical thing. There's a straightforward, although in the case of things like your car, not practically carry-outable operations that would allow you to create that connection. It also goes the other way. So things like the Pythagorean theorem in mathematics, there's a direct algorithm that attaches to the Pythagorean theorem. And in point of fact, if you've done the equal knotted circular rope thing, if you knot a rope into 12 separate sections, then you can pull it out into a right triangle. That fact is a derivable algorithm from the Pythagorean theorem and all of the other Pythagorean triples as well, in fact. So anyhow, it turns out that there's a absolutely direct one-to-one correspondence between mathematics and everything, ideas, physical objects, all of it. And there's a pretty deep principle that goes back centuries, before my country was even founded, that you're not allowed to patent math. And math discovered that there's not any such thing as not math. And so, strictly speaking, according to our present understanding of reality, nobody can patent anything.
Yeah. But isn't that just a layer of understanding? Like, when you're talking to a lawyer, like my background is a bit of a lawyer, so I see every aspect of something through a lens of law. But at the same time, if you ask a surgeon, he would see something through the eyes of medicine or
Absolutely,
surgery.
yeah.
And
Well,
we are both correct, but still wrong.
yeah. Well, so this is something that's been ongoing in human history for quite some time. Aristotle looks around on Earth and looks up at the heavens, and in the heavens you see stuff that goes around in circles, and on Earth you see stuff that either sits still or falls down. And he says, "Oh, Earth is fallen and broken, as you can see. Everything, you look around and things break and they fall down. Heaven is perfect and circles are perfect. They're awesome. That's just how it is. There's a nature that separates where we are from, and yeah, if you look at it, that is what it looks like. But then we look a lot closer and we discover that the heaven isn't moving in circles, and that stuff here does keep going, but if you slow it down enough to see the friction and stuff, that happens. And then Isaac Newton says, no, there's just a universe. It's up there, it's down here. There's different physical properties of the environment that you're in, but it's the same stuff in both places. This process has been going on, and in the 20th century, breakthroughs in information theory, proof theory, general computation, quantum physics, and relativity completely rewritten our foundational understandings of the universe that we occupy and the systems and tools, including law and medicine, that we use to interact with it. And our societies mostly haven't caught up. You can say E equals MC squared to sort of like anybody that's been through school, and they'll be like, yes, I recognize that exists. But if you say E equals H nu, which is sort of the other big fundamental equation of 20th century physics, nobody will understand that. And if you start trying to rattle off Schrodinger's equation, people are going to look at you like you're insane, because you are. And the same thing goes for computers. Alan Turing, his name is starting to become a bit of a household word with some of the movies that have come out and so on.
The
But
Turing test, with AI.
his ideas are, literally ubiquitous at this point. The most ubiquitous products in human history are all computational products. But the core ideas of computational mathematics are not only virtually unknown, they are totally unknown to the general public. They're virtually unknown even within the halls of the tech elite. The highly successful titans of the tech industry. You got, Gates, Bezos, Zuckerberg, the Google guys. Of those 5 players, the Google guys are the only ones that have any computational mathematical chops at all, and the only ones that turned an algorithm into their business. The rest of them are all pretty standard, either businessmen or hucksters or religious icons that just happen to have access to computers.
Moving to a bit different trajectory, but still perhaps on the same. What do you stand, about this dilemma in the modern science when we had, this Renaissance scientists like Leonardo da Vinci and Newton, like you said, who were exploring lots of fields and layers of understanding. And nowadays we have this understanding of, very specific niche subject. We have these scientists who are so-called experts on such a sub niche that perhaps you don't even see an application towards it. And on the other side, when you see the popularization of AI, I see ChatGPT as sort of generalized AI intelligence, which from my point is kind of ironic because even our mind is not a general mind. It's not a general processor. It switches on different parts for different tasks. So where are you on this area of either universal science, like Leonardo da Vinci, or very niche down scientist who knows, I don't know, endocrinology for kids who are for female?
I think the modern drive towards specialization is radically overdone, and it's cost us enormously. When I look at the history of large and important moves, I see cross-field synthesis. Going back again to the thing that I just mentioned, Newton unifies the physics of our everyday world and outer space. But we see this all over the place. Of more recent vintage, one of the most famous math problems in history, something called Fermat's last theorem, it was finally proved to be true by this guy named Andrew Wiles, and he did it by taking 2 apparently very different parts of mathematics and showing that in the specific case that he was working for, they had a one-to-one correspondence. And that has now become part of a much larger project, which has had an enormous amount of fruitful work done in it, called the Langlands Project, to unify these vast swaths of apparently unrelated mathematics. We see this too. One of my favorite examples from 20th century physics, de Broglie, and I'm almost certainly mispronouncing that, sorry, but de Broglie was a brilliant guy, somewhat dissolute. I think he came from an aristocratic family, and he was basically turning himself into a lifetime student. He had gone to college or university, and he was just like, this is great. This is awesome. I'm just going to keep doing this. And his department essentially said, write your PhD or we're going to kick you out. Like we don't do permanent residency here. And so going back to the 2 things I just referenced, E equals mc squared, E equals h nu. E equals h nu is the sort of core understanding of initially of quantum mechanics. E equals mc squared is, of course, the most famous relativity equation of all time. So de Broglie basically says h nu equals mc squared, but to make it a little less obvious, he divides through by c, and nu divided by c is 1 over lambda. So he basically says equals h over lambda c, and he turns that in, and they're like, this, okay, sure, energy is energy, equations work like this, but this is obviously nonsense by some dilettante that wants to keep going to frat parties. Like, come on. And so they ship it off to Einstein, and they're like, okay, like, we're not smart enough to figure out why this guy's obviously insane, But Einstein is smart enough to figure out why this guy's obviously insane, and then we can get this bastard. So they ship it off to Einstein, and Einstein is like, of course. Why didn't anybody think of this before? This explains everything. Because there was something called the Bohr model of the atom. And if you've ever seen like an atomic symbol with the little circles or ovals going around something, that's the Bohr model. And the thing about the Bohr model is that the only atom it explains is hydrogen, or very, very expensively created ions of other things. So if you knock one of the electrons off of helium, then it follows the Bohr. If it's shell complete, it doesn't work. But nobody could understand why the orbital levels that Bohr predicts were the orbital levels. Like, why are these particular orbits allowed and no other orbits are allowed? Well, Einstein notices that if you use de Broglie's formula, the orbits that come out of Bohr's system are the resonant frequencies of the standing waves of the electron mass. And so that's why there's a integer number of wave peak valleys that you can fit into specific orbit structures. And we then, other people then use that to do the extensive computations that create the SPDF model that presently exists, that turned out to pretty much totally recapitulate the geometric ideas that the chemistry people had very painstakingly worked out over centuries. And he was right. It was like, and it was literally staring everybody in the face that much, like, an 8-year-old being introduced to pre-algebra in 1907 could have said, hey, E equals two different things. What if they equal each other? And that just didn't happen.
Yeah, it's clear only when somebody tells you it's clear.
Right, exactly.
What do you think the next evolution in computer science will be? I know everybody's talking about AI, although I've studied a bit of data science, and I'm seeing a bigger data model. It's not basically artificial intelligence because it's not self-sustaining. On the other hand, we have the mechanics of quantum computing. What do you think the next breakthrough will actually be that will be remembered in 100 years? Self-sustaining, self-conscious AI, or cloud computing, or quantum mechanics, or something else?
I'm not particularly impressed by generative AI so far, but it's much more important cousin, reinforcement learning. I'm very impressed by reinforcement learning.
So we're talking neural networks or something else?
It's still neural networks, but it's a different way of using it. So they are both somewhat based off the transformer architecture. That seems to be the best way to exploit neural networks, which are a very old technology. I had a class that talked about neural networks as one of the approaches to AI when I was in college back in the 90s. The original proposals around that, I believe, go back to the 50s. So neural nets are not...
So it's actually a long time ago.
Are not a new phenomenon, but this method of using them is. What reinforcement learning does is, so first off, what neural nets do can be called programming by example. So if you can provide examples of what a program is supposed to do, you can train a neural net to become a program that acts like that. So what the generative systems are basically doing is you take some enormous corpus of information, the entire World Wide Web, all the videos on YouTube, whatever, and you say, okay, these are the examples. I'll give you some snippets of Shakespeare or Steven Spielberg or, somebody dancing on Twitch or whatever, and I want you to give me the rest of it. And the thing figures out how to do that, basically. And that's what that whole huge model thing, and the various billionaires that say they're going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on mass installations that are going to suck up more power than the Eastern Seaboard, and maybe they will. They've got $100 billion. Who knows? What reinforcement learning does
when I see that models and all the hype around the commercialization, I always find myself remembering, those basic neural networks assignments that you were given. Recognize the cat.
Right. Right.
And it's so silly because it's just a bigger model.
Exactly. Yeah. So what reinforcement learning does is says, okay, let's say I had some task I needed to do. Let me make sort of a basic model that can sort of do that task, and let me give it this framework that lets it work a little bit harder. And so this really got its start in game AI, and the most famous ones are the Go. So Go is an Oriental, started in China, highly popularized in Japan. It's the oldest continuously played game for which we have rules, and it's a much deeper and more complex game than chess is. And up until like 2007-ish, basically there were no Go programs that were worthy of the name. Like the best Go program in the world was something that you could train a reasonably intelligent human being in a few, maybe months with top flight training to just regularly beat. And then there was a breakthrough using this sort of random search technology that made the Go programs better than, introductory children were, but still not even close to professional level or like good club player level. But that formed the basis for reinforcement learning because they had something that was sort of tolerably okay. And so what they did is they created this framework that said, okay, I'm not going to figure out what the best move using my technique is. I'm going to sort of project all of the potential future moves that I could make. And then I'm going to use my technique in parallel on all of those things. And I'm going to take the best recommendation. I'm going to look at what the highest probability of victory I can get out of this system is. And then what I'm going to do once I've got that framework put together is I'm going to train a neural network to act like that system that's looking a little deeper into this thing, probabilities. And once I'm done, once that new neural net acts like this complicated, thing, pitch out my old crappy version of playing this thing, and I'm going to plug my new neural net into that system. That's why it's called reinforcement learning, because as you learn a little bit more about the system, what happens when you do this is that the neural net actually gains insights into the situation it's being placed. Right now, there's something called TCEC. It's basically the computerized chess championship. They're currently undergoing a Swiss style. The main part of the championship is over. They have the various engines play 250 games against each other. And they actually set up the board. They make them make the same first moves and play white and black of each side. The one that won was an open source system called Stockfish. Second place, and this has been true for several years now, is another open source project called Leela, where people just donate clock time, computer time, to one of these reinforcement learning systems. Leela is actually currently leading the Swiss, where they're all just playing against each other. And the thing is that while Stockfish is the strongest tactical engine on Earth, Leela appears to be a better strategic chess player than Stockfish is. And that if you hand them a position that's locked up enough that there aren't really any tactical breakthroughs and you have to make some kind of deep strategic insight to do something, Leela will beat Stockfish because Leela understands chess at a deeper level than we as humans understand chess. And there are grandmasters that study Leela games to learn more about chess and become better at it. And so it starts there. It starts with, we built a Go machine years and years and years ago that's way better than we are at Go, and that we believe is actually way better than we're ever even going to get at Go. But that reinforcement technique in the years since then has been used to develop radically better computational fluid dynamics, which at least appear to be visually correct. We don't really understand how they're working under the hood, so It's sort of hard to tell. Google dropped a paper where they described several million new kinds of crystal structure that probably exist. They also did protein folding, which has been almost the holy grail of microbiology. Basically, your cells have DNA and RNA that goes to the Golgi bodies and creates these proteins. And the proteins, once they're in cellular situations, clump up, and they clump up in a way that gives them this thing called the active region on them that has chemically and biologically important properties. And we couldn't really figure out, given an amino acid string, there's 20 different characters, and proteins range, they're, sort of the average is 400. So you got a string of 400 letters, basically. We couldn't figure out how to go from that string of 400 letters to the clump. Google figured it out. We now regard this as largely a solved problem. They released a paper this summer where they where they said that they'd actually gotten the Holy Grail. They'd reversed it. They'd used reinforcement learning on the reinforcement learning thing to be able to take a shape and get back a clump. And they claim that they've created a protein that will depolymerize plastic, basically turn plastic back into unit chain hydrocarbons that you could then chemically reuse for whatever you wanted. I haven't seen evidence yet of that going into the wild and getting used, so we'll see whether or not they actually did what they said they did. But the claim that they made is seriously revolutionary. And reinforcement learning is a lot cheaper than supermassive models. It's not cheap. It's not the kind of thing that works out for sort of private individuals, although the Leela project demonstrates that it's something that we can collectively do on the internet. And so I think there's some real potential there if we can figure out how to reorient our society in ways that incentivize contributing towards reinforcement learning projects to solve problems that have real consequences. We would be able to exploit our mass distributed computation capabilities in ways that are pretty game breaking.
Well, what I'm hearing is, this folding DNA. I remember years ago, probably 10, 20 years, there was this distributed computing system where you downloaded some kind of app and it used your processing power to help out some researchers.
Folding at home, yes.
Folding at home, yeah, sorry, that's the name, yeah. And it's kind of went by now, and it's kind of interesting because now at home we have more and more powerful computers. Of course, Google has supercomputers, but even they seems to have built lots of core units that are replaceable. So basically lots of computers. So this question of open source or distributed computing, that's actually very interesting. But when you're explaining that, I was always considering Google has this on the outside, from the public view, this image of Google, and then this Gemini who's now going out. When the people who are kind of interested in computing, there's also this Go language, if you're familiar with them. And they never explain how their Gemini and everything works, although they hinted they're using their operating system, Go language, quite extensively, because they claim, and there have been some reports, it uses the processing power much, much more efficiently. So there's this question. It seems that we have a revolution on every specter of the way. We have a revolution on the microchip specter, the operating system, the programming system, and at the same time we have really cheap and perhaps popular solutions like ChatGPT.
One of the interesting things about process improvement and algorithmic improvement and stuff like that is that sort of whoever goes last wins. So there was a boom in the early 80s, and it was a neural net based boom at that time as well. But of course, computers are literally billions of times more powerful today than they were back then. And that boom fizzled out very, very rapidly because pretty quickly they managed to work out that pretty much we did not have the hardware to achieve the things that they were trying to throw these problems at. But we now have, these billions of times more powerful hardware. But we also made other breakthroughs in how we use hardware to much more efficiently achieve those things. And so if you have something that doubles your ability to utilize hardware and you make the hardware a billion times better, and, let's say you do both of these things at the same time. I come up with a way to make hardware twice as effective, and you spend 50 years making the hardware a billion times better. Well, my initial idea that was sort of, one good, by the time you get done with your work 50 years later, if my work is still relevant, now my work is a billion good. I get it for free because what I'm doing is making what you're doing stronger. And so we have layers and layers. We've improved our ability to multiply things. We've improved data handling. We've improved the transformer architecture I was talking about is a radically better way to sort of take advantage of neural networks than systems that they were using back then. And all of those things are multiplicative on top of having billions of times more transistors than they had back then. And so that combination basically means that pretty much the software guys are always going to be able to kind of swoop in the last reel and rescue the girl and get all the credit, in spite of the fact that there's an enormous amount of a lot of very smart people doing very crazy amounts of work, basically all of which is necessary to get up to where we actually are.
But there's also this notion we have upgraded all the necessary parts to make great stuff. But then this part of the generative GPT, so to speak, when we have kind of realized, at least from the people who know something about it, that if we feed it enough junk will come out. That's the problem. If we feed it the whole internet is, of course, sliced towards.
Oh, absolutely. And there's some really relevant and publicly known, although not really publicly talked about, instances of this. I think Microsoft actually had a generative AI system. This is over 10 years ago that they basically put up on Twitter, and the idea was that it would actively engage with its entire follower base. So it was going to learn how to talk on Twitter live in front of everybody. And of course, trolls instantaneously turned it into every kind of troll you can possibly imagine. I'm going to get this thing to repeat the complete works of Adolf Hitler. That's easy to do. I'm going to get this thing to be sexist. I'm going to get this thing to, confirm that up is down. Whatever you wanted to do, you could do it. And I think it was less than a day. They terminated it and stopped talking about it. Articles exist. You can find them with some effort. I can't remember what the name of this thing was.
I don't know, ChatGPT went.
Oh no, this, like I said, this was a long time ago, and yeah, it's sort of a warning. That's why I personally have been most interested in research around alignment, and that's what my system is effectively based on. It's a alignment mechanism, and that's something that again has very real world applications, because markets are the alignment mechanism that our economies use, and they are breaking because we've also been plugging generative AIs into our marketplace for well over a decade at this point, closing in on 2, and the markets are becoming radically less rational as a result of most of the signals being generated by computers, basically for no reason.
I've glimpsed through your white paper. Basically, your solution is a kind of a system that will replace marketplace. It's
replace the operating principles, yes. The existing market operators could easily pilot this and then sort of watch it cannibalize their existing procedures to their own enrichment because of the greater efficiency would cost them a lot less to operate and would also allow them to capture a much greater share of the current market transaction costs and overheads. So they could make a lot more money if they decided to do that. Or, competitors could arise that could set up markets that would cannibalize their user base without it. But a marketplace depends on a lot of factors, most important of which are customers. And this is just one mechanism for that market to operate in.
When I glimpsed through your system, I'm not claiming that I understand it correctly. I got this notion that whenever you introduce something to the marketplace where supposedly informed buyers and sellers come, supposedly, there's always these speculators who get either insight or they think they have the insight about the information which your system seems to address. But then the second idea was, isn't it anytime you bring a solution to the table, then there's the next level, how to predict the prediction?
Well, so that's actually what I was directly going after. Make the predicting the prediction and all of its infinite recursion of predicting the prediction of the prediction of the prediction and whatever else, however many times you want to say the word, are all concentrated within the one prediction market that sits aside. So it's taking advantage of this notion we can predict the future, sort of, kind of, good enough for government work, statistically okay. And in fact, our abilities to do that are the entire basis of financial and economic organization. And the fact that, strictly speaking, of course, we can't, is the basis of various crises that have occurred through time immemorial and will occur through time immemorial because we can't actually predict the future. We can do pretty good most of the time. And so what having a sort of harness system like this does is it creates an environment that as we develop these machine systems to do things, we develop them to achieve things that make us better off. Because right now, our systems have a pretty decent track record of sort of lifting up human beings, but those systems were based around humans interacting with each other. And what generative AI does do is demonstrate that we can no longer trust that interactions are happening human to human. While there's definitely some uncanny valley and some other weird stuff with a lot of generative AI stuff, it's passing Turing tests on the regular and very publicly, and it's getting better and better at doing that. And so we will be less and less able to trust that the guy next to you or the in the message queue is a guy and not a robot. And so incentives that work to get people to behave in ways that made other people, better off or not dead or whatever, incentives don't mean anything to robots in that sense. And so we need incentives that can be simultaneously meaningful to people and robots. And so that's what.
Can I ask you regarding your system? It says you are addressing the commodities market. So that would be basically oil, gold, and grains, and cattle and stuff. So what I kind of didn't understand is because I'm not such a financial specialist, but I would deem that, gold is in limited resources on Earth. It is,
So
however,
gold is
impacted.
probably, of the commodity markets, the least suited to this system because gold is less a commodity and more of a monetary quality. So the vast majority of the value of gold is the fact that many people, and in fact, many countries, treat it as a monetary object. Silver has been almost entirely demonetized, but it isn't completely demonetized. And gold isn't even remotely monetized. If you sort of add up how much circulating currency and credit exists on Earth and divide by the amount of gold that our technology would allow us to get access to, an ounce of gold would be hundreds of times more valuable than our ounces of gold currently are. But on the other hand, if you could sort of wave your magic wand backwards through whatever that pattern was and make it so that nobody would regard gold as a valuable, asset or storage, it was simply an industrial metal that had certain properties that made it useful for heat ducting and electrical, probably be a lot closer to the value of platinum, which again would be hundreds of, nearly 100 times less per ounce. So that's not a good approximation for my system. Commodities are the financially simplest marketplace. The kinds I'm talking about, because you have a group of people that makes these things and needs to sell them. Yes, a farmer can eat the food that comes off their farm, but they produce radically more food than they could eat before it would, spoil and go to waste. And they spend a lot of money doing it. They need to sell it to recoup that money and go forward. And then you have other groups of people that need whatever that substance is. Obviously, we all eat, but beyond that, if you've got a factory, you need power and metal to make the chairs that you produce or whatever. And so again, you need access to these markets to provide the raw materials coming in that produce whatever it is that you produce. And so that structure where you have a group of people that make stuff and needs to get rid of it, and another group of people that needs that stuff, and those two groups have very little overlap, has a common interest in a common understanding of where the world is going. If you have something that's simply being recirculated in an attempt to find somebody desperate enough to take a stupid deal on the other side, then there's no common interest in there existing a common understanding, because if the only reason to trade is because you think that you're screwing somebody else over, if you remove all other screwing out of the system, there's no incentive to trade anymore, and you don't have a marketplace. So this is the simplest form of finance that exists, and that's what I targeted.
So you're talking about these so-called soft commodities, so grain, carbs, and so on. I was trying to ask you, how would your system predict or mitigate the risk, of environmental factors, hurricanes, bad weather, some kind of disease or some.
Pretty much the same way the existing markets do.
So aggregate on the global level.
Right, exactly. And also, one of the large inputs into climate modeling and weather modeling is an enormous amount of money that's been pumped into satellites and ground stations and so on by people that want to speculate on the wheat market or the rice market and would like to know how much it's actually going to rain in Eastern Asia this year, because that's going to really affect the price of rice and
the quality of the rice,
and the quality of the rice. Exactly. Yeah. And so again, we have this thing where we're developing these very cool technologies that have these capacities to do this kind of stuff. And while major natural disaster prediction is still in its infancy, we can't really do earthquakes at all. We're a lot better at hurricanes than we were when I was a kid, but we're still pretty bad at hurricanes. We can't do tornadoes at all. They're generally not a big, global scale problem, but they might become one at some point. Volcanoes we can't do at all, but these things can have global impacts. And if Iceland is going to, double the amount of sulfur dioxide that's in the upper atmosphere again, like they did back in the 1700s, and you manage to work that out ahead of time, then in any kind of market, you could make yourself a lot of money doing that.
I've heard this, article that some grain producers are actually now buying futures because on the West Coast and on the East Coast, they speculate is opposite weather. So if they have bad weather on the West, then perhaps the East will have good weather. So they kind of mitigate their own risk. You, on the other
That's
hand, on this system are
that,
considering that this future or forecasting or speculators are a bit bad or trying to mitigate it on some kind of very mutual fund, if I understood correctly.
well, so
How does that
in my
work?
system, yeah. So that's actually pretty standard practice. In fact, this is an example I like to trot out, specifically concerning wheat. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, that was, I believe, the third largest wheat producer on Earth, invading the fifth largest wheat producer on Earth. And as a result, the wheat market went absolutely wild. Wheat prices
Yeah.
spiked. And as a result of that, the number one and number two wheat producers on Earth, which is Canada and the United States, increased total wheat production by 0 acres because those wild price spikes, the farms were all hedged and they didn't see any of that. Those price spikes were exacerbated by the people who actually owned the right to sell that wheat, who were the kind of deep-pocketed middlemen that wanted to make as much money as possible, naturally, and could make more money by making that spike higher and shorter, whereas a broader and more moderate one would have allowed the entire system to actually produce wheat in ways that would have been a lot more valuable to the global food eating industry, i.e. humans. So where hedging is incredibly common, it's actually necessary because, again, the farms mostly are operating on credit and can't afford the market risk. Forget weather risk or anything like that. They've got other forms of insurance for that for them personally. But if you show up at the marketplace, it is possible for you to get hammered by an algorithm and wind up accidentally selling your crop for 10% less than it potentially could be. And if you're operating at, 8, 10, 12% margins, getting 10% less than the market rate will destroy you completely. And so you hedge and you're like, well, I'll just take a deal that's, 3 or 4% worse than I could get and so that I know what it is, and I'll use up some of my margin for that. And the other side does that too. The people buying the wheat take 3 or 4%. And wheat's it's really big. In less liquid markets, it's a much bigger spread between the two sides. And you add all that up, and hundreds of billions, probably in the United States around $1 trillion, and globally trillions of dollars, gets chewed up by people needing to acquire hedges to deal with the risks that are intrinsic in the marketplace. And as I mentioned, we're plugging computers into the market that are jacking up the risks of the marketplace, which makes the humans need to give up even more money to stay in business. And yeah, that's the death spiral of the current system.
One of the things that, if I understood correctly, is also you increase the market margin of clearing. So it's not immediate, if I understood correctly. So it's in a different period. But from what I understood, that would probably be less of a liquid market. So how much of a spread towards current liquid market or current point on marketplace? What exactly did that mean, actually? Yeah.
Okay.
Can
Well,
you
again,
explain?
that gets into a sort of general misconception.
Mm.
So market liquidity is essentially connected to market reaction time, and it has to do with how many deals exist in the marketplace. And particularly with computerization and sort of globalized communication, markets have responded to that by becoming faster and faster and faster and faster. But the commodities, again, are kind of a special space because you're talking about moving physical stuff around. And while we move physical stuff around faster today than we did 500 years ago, we don't move it around a lot faster, really. Moving physical objects is expensive and heavy. And while we can get stuff to the opposite side of the world in, a couple of weeks instead of 3 or 4 months, that's not anything compared to the million times a second heartbeat that the markets are operating on. And so liquidity is really only relevant at delivery speeds. And what the market's actually doing is borrowing this liquidity concept that got a lot of its play out of the stock markets, which stocks are at this point purely electronic objects that you really can move around at the speed of light. In the event that we discover how to transport oil and steel and corn and wheat at the speed of light, it will become relevant to have markets that are operating microsecond by microsecond. But what they're mostly doing is providing, over the span of a single human's decision cycle, which is going to be minutes long, billions of pieces of information, which is more than a human being can actually absorb. So they're actually making the decision making worse. And so that's why my market has time periods that are comporting with the decisions that are being made, both from a human consciousness perspective, but also from an actual physically realizable perspective. And there's been some problems. Goldman Sachs worked out a bug in the aluminum market and basically transferred, in some cases just on paper, all aluminum distribution on Earth through Detroit. And because the London Metals Exchange had a rule that in order to be certified as a bonded warehouse, that you had to be able to deliver so many tons per day. And the idea is that, the warehouse owner can't not give you your aluminum when you ask for it. Well, because they had effectively routed all aluminum transfers through these warehouses, and the limit was per industry or per sort of company, per city. So the fact that they own dozens and dozens of warehouses in Detroit, they only actually had to reach the limit for one thing. And so then what they did is they waited for a while and built up a 1-year paper backlog. So they'd been moving everything in and out. They'd been delivering people's aluminum, but on paper, they'd been storing up how much that they didn't have to send if they didn't want to. And once it was all kind of up that they had a 1-year waiting list, they said, okay, cool. You just bought some aluminum. We've got it right here. This is your aluminum. We don't actually have to ship it to you for a year. So we can store it for you for a year, and here's our storage of aluminum that we're going to be shipping you fees. They're a little higher than our regular fees, but you can pay it and get your aluminum that you own that you want right now in a year, or you can pay our special deliver it right now fee, which is a little bit more than you might expect, and we'll give you your aluminum that's right here, right now. And what do you want to do? And they ran that for a few years. They sold the business off to somebody else, and they jacked up the global price of aluminum by I think it was something like 8 or 10%, which is just an enormous amount of money. The global aluminum market is, I believe, on the order of $100 billion a year. So they basically sucked like $10 billion a year for several years out of the entire global economy on what is, by any rational standards, highway robbery.
Well, can I provoke you a little bit? Is this system operating, or is it just an idea still?
It is still just an idea. There are 4 different projects that are in various stages of trying to start up that would incorporate this technology into them. Starting new marketplaces is rough. Bringing ideas to existing marketplaces is the kind of thing you really need a patent for, which is why I've been fighting with the patent office for a decade. Nobody actually can access this yet. Although anybody could start anytime they wanted to give it a shot.
Did you have some kind of inquiries from bigger players?
Well, like I said, there are 4 different projects. One's still in kind of submarine mode, so I can't talk about it too much, but they're coming out of Sweden. There's another guy in Switzerland he's an East African, and he's trying to build a coffee index in East Africa. There's a South African trying to build a coal index in South Africa. And there's another team that's trying to do a blockchain DAO system that would use this technology inside it, trying to fundraise in Singapore. COVID has been a very mixed blessing. The the shutdowns and some of the things attached to them have made fundraising for some of the projects that are longer ongoing a lot more difficult. On the other hand, the much greater propensity of people to be willing to talk to some random stranger online has led to several of those conversations even happening in the first place. So I was able to network much more strongly during the lockdowns. And yeah, I mean, I just last week, I was talking to trade embassies from the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Australia. And those are very long shots, but when all you've got is lottery tickets, you just have to buy a whole bunch of them. So
No,
I'm out
I
there
didn't
pitching.
want to put you on the spot. Only I have an MBA, and the reason I asked you is because when I saw your idea, it sounded a lot like a lot of good ideas thrown together as a system. And the classic venture capitalism startup idea would be pick one and do one. And when I read through your ideas and the concepts, I'm not saying that I understood everything. I was thinking about why don't you focus mainly first on the information phase? Because you have really good background, you have really good systems, you thought about the problem. So I think you would be very strong there. So that's why I was asking you whether it's a concept more or it's something that's already working.
Yeah.
This information kind of would achieve your goal that you're trying to achieve, a more stable, less volatile price.
The thing is that while it is a lot and there's a bunch of pieces, the pieces it's sort of an arch is the way I usually describe it. The pieces work because they're all curving into and supporting each other. And so
like a puzzle, yeah, I understood
right.
that
So
part. Yeah,
I don't really see how I can't decompose this into smaller working systems. I wish I could. I wish that I had a simpler explanation for this or a simpler system of how it worked, or one that worked for way to do it at this level of complexity for larger swaths, beyond just commodities. Because again, that's sort of a very specialized subgroup within finance, and just getting to those people is difficult. Kind of the universe works the way it works, and this is the smallest, simplest, useful thing I could think of with this approach. Part of getting it out there and trying to get other people interested is hopefully finding other smart people that would get interested and look at the approach and maybe be able to converse with me or do their own work and do better. Frankly, that would be great. But that sort of just personal circumstances is and this is the best I think I can do. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm gonna do what I think is the best I can do for as long as I can manage to do it.
From what I read, you and from talking to you, you're very passionate about this project. So I was wondering what was the origin story? What started this idea? And you were wondering about the problem because it had to be some kind of trigger.
Well, so going back to alignment, that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking about we have the internet, we have these computer systems. I'd worked at several startups that either stalled or actually failed because management made decisions that files on computers that they owned contained information that said that that was the wrong choice. But they never looked at those files. And so this idea of, we have this vast amount of data being produced, but we don't have mechanisms that turn that into decision making. Like we don't know how to make these connections. So how do we solve these alignment problems? And I'd seen AI. Again, that's another kind of thing where we can make computers be very, very good at doing complex, deep situational awareness problems. But the way that we do it isn't something that we can trust to do complex, deep situational awareness problems. So how do we square that circle? We're trying to, Internet of Things, there's a local company that has these incredibly low power transistor things. They're basically trying to put a sensor on every blade of grass in the world. Think about how much data floods in from that we already can't cope
digital
with the amount of
garbage.
data that we
Yeah.
have. Right, exactly. So how can we design a communication system that creates consensuses that we can trust? So that's the problem I was thinking about. And when I came up with my approach breakthrough using game theory, told my friend and neighbor at the time about it, and he asked me if I could predict the stock market with it. And I said, no, you can't, because you can't pay enough for the information. But I had this insight leaving his house, walking through my backyard, that markets work by paying people for their information. So there might be some way to rejigger this notion into this other sort of complex thing and be able to make a marketplace out of it. And I'd had, sort of intro econ. I knew the basics, that proofs existed that markets were basically perfect at aggregating information. Sadly, it turns out that that proof actually has an assumptional flaw in it, but I had never examined that deeply, particularly not after learning about algorithmic mathematical techniques. And so I was like, okay, so markets are perfect. There might be some complicated way that I could turn this thing to a marketplace. Let me solve this problem, because I'm fascinated in solving these kinds of problems. But also, if this approach produces something that's, comparably good to these perfect marketplaces, but has all of these other applications, then that sort of validates. It's like, okay, if this thing works half as good as perfect, and you can use it for these things that you can't use this other thing for, then, you can have half perfect in these other places. That's pretty good. And so I worked on that problem and eventually wrote up some code to, do the processing. And that's when I discovered that it wasn't half as good or 99% as good, but probably hundreds of thousands of times better. And that's when I went back and re-examined the proofs and found the sort of false assumption that's built into it, which, I've gone through at that point a decade and a half of, computational mathematics, which reveals a lot of false assumptions. I'm sort of, standing on the shoulders of giants on that one. And then once you realize that what's broken about the marketplaces, these, global financial crises and latest outrage from the Fed and China's going nuts, and that's all perfectly understandable. Not, specific dates and times at which each one of them will happen, but the inevitable chaotic breakdown of a system that has actually had its foundational assumptions violated isn't terribly, we don't worship the Greek gods anymore, and nobody would even really think to, when the foundational assumptions of your systems break, the systems break. And that happened in markets decades ago, and I appear to be the only person that noticed. And so, yeah, I'm pretty passionate about it because I'm very dependent on the economy to exist. I don't live in my own castle where I grow all my own food and, have all of my own defensive weaponry. Like I operate as part of the economic system, or in some cases would like to.
So it's a system. So you would need a couple of buyers and a couple of sellers in order for it to work. Did I get that part right?
Yeah, except I would actually need a couple of dozen buyers and a couple of dozen sellers, which is a higher bar to clear, obviously. Again, that's why most valuable people are the ones that I haven't really gotten on. The people that are presently interested are all trying to create something new. The most valuable people would be people that would like to pilot an improvement for something that already exists. But again, it would probably be necessary at minimum to have a patent to approach that angle of things. I have spoken to people in that zone, and asking about the patent is not always their first question, but it's in the top three.
Yeah, I was thinking about the agency problem, whether it's financially viable for the players to become part of your system if they would earn a little bit less than they're playing now. Or, that old saying that, you don't expect for a man to solve a problem when his salary depends on him not understanding the problem.
That's true, but in point of fact, the existing operators would earn a great deal more. So I'd mentioned before that the U.S. government figures suggest that the current trade overhead in commodities just in the United States is on the order of $1 trillion. The CME group that oversees the vast majority of that has total revenues of $4 billion, and commodities are not, in fact, most of what they do. While they do handle virtually all the commodity trade in the United States, a lot of their revenue and trade volume is actually international currency trading. They're basically the clearinghouse for that kind of behavior. And so they could retain all of that. Let's say it was half and half. I don't even think it's that much, but let's say it's half and half.
Well, it's usually Pareto effect, 20-80, something's 20,
Right.
something's
Yeah.
80.
Let's say it's 100%. Let's say they're making $4 billion, which is a round up. Let's say they're making $4 billion a year handling commodity trade out of the $1 trillion that's available. So they could cut that cost in half, make their producers and consumers vastly happier and vastly wealthier, and have $500 billion to decide to divide up in the cake. They could decide that they wanted $400 billion even, and still be offering their primary important money supply a vast reduction in their costs. And while that does really put the squeeze to the middlemen, the bone that I have to throw to them is return on investment. The existing return on investment is pretty flat across all financial opportunities, because when somebody figures out a way to make one kind of financial opportunity be above market, money floods in, and that basically grays out everything and pulls it back down to earth. But because my system ties investment to information, money can't flood in, and you can create a market that has durably super high rates of return. And so while there might be, in that particular scenario, only 10% as much money that's up for grabs, the amount of money that you'd have to invest to go after that 10% could be only 1% of what you're currently investing. And so then the other 99% you could throw over into bonds and stocks and all the other markets or private equity, everything else that's doing about the same as everything else, which is about the same as you were getting out of things before. That 99% would do almost as well as your current things are doing, and your remaining 1% would match it, and suddenly you're doing a lot better too. So aside from the people that are tertiary attendants to the marketplace, credit suppliers to sort of, hedge bottom feeders and some of the other players who would effectively completely lose their revenue, but again, who aren't directly useful to the marketplace and aren't direct clients of the market. Who cares what happens? If a village comes up with a new way to make shoes for itself, and as a result of that, people on the other side of the world that nobody in that village knows or will ever meet, have to change the way that they, raise cows or something, nobody in the village is going to care. And similarly, if everyone that grows stuff out of the ground or mines stuff out of the ground is making more money, and everybody that makes products out of that stuff is making more money, and everybody that knows about those markets is making more money, they're not going to care about all the other people that used to be making money the way the system used to work.
So next step is fighting for your patent. What are the time frames? How much time does usually take the court to decide?
So the appeals process is normally pretty brief, but it's actually longer for patents than anything else. I've got about 2 months to put together my brief. Then the patent office has about a month to put together their counter, and then can, if I want, take up to 2 weeks to rebut their counter. I can request oral arguments if I want to, but I think that would delay things more, and I'm not certain that that would be terribly valuable one way or another. And then that would be sent to the court. I have some procedural monkey wrenching that I have to work out, and I might just drop the ball there. I've already had some problems logging into the website that you use to actually file these things in the first place. And so hopefully I won't make a procedural misstep that just sort of drops me in the soup. So far, the helplines from the courts have been extremely helpful. The helplines from the patent office were being very obstreperous, but a couple weeks ago, the ombuds gave me the direct line to the director's office, and I asked them a question, and I got calls back from basically every single department in the patent office. Like a lady from the trademark office called me up, and I don't have a trademark really, but some trees definitely got shook off that one. But yes, the core of my argument is that they can either do sort of the clean and principled thing, which is wipe out the patent system. They can accept that these currently fairly vaguely worded things are in fact all physically and mathematically verifiable quantities that, using algorithmic and thermodynamic techniques, we can actually put numbers on. And if you do that, then my patent is in the zone. It's pretty high up in the zone, but there are things that have been granted that are bigger deals, not economically, but efficiency-wise. Things like telephony, for example, the speed of communication of sound through air versus the speed of electrical signals over distance is a larger algorithmic improvement than a few 100,000 times. It's bigger than that is. And nobody thinks that telephones are an illegitimate patent. Well, almost nobody thinks that. So that's basically what's going on. And then the patent office, while it's fairly technical, for years has been advancing arguments that are completely foundationless. They look okay, but they don't actually have any evidence attached to them. Even the latest decision, they basically resurrected an objection that they were forced to abandon years ago, said that they're resurrecting it and just affirming that it's true because they didn't defend it even though it's not part of the accusation. So imagine if you were falsely arrested, contested the false arrest, and got the cops to say, oh yeah, we just made that up, we're not going to do it. And then you were falsely arrested again on different charges, and then they convicted you because you didn't defend yourself against the first false arrest during the second false arrest. It's like, but you already admitted it was a false arrest. You're just using the fact that I didn't. Yeah, that's the level of argument that I'm currently facing. And while there's a lot of it, it's all specious. So basically, I'll lay that before the court, and likewise lay before counsel that they can either assert that everything that I'm saying is tautological, because it's gonna be. I'm not really good at not math, so tautology is kind of the level of argument I'm capable of. So they can either assert that what I'm saying is tautological and provide their recommendation about sort of which of the reasonable outcomes they prefer, or they can commit perjury, in which case I will use my rebuttal to demonstrate, again, tautologically, that they've advanced a false argument before the court. And, well, we'll see what happens. I have no control over what judges and lawyers decide to do with their lives.
So expecting within 1 year or 2 years to have this some kind of decision, yes or no, or whatever.
I'd expect actually within a quarter. If I take 2 months and they take a month, then that's 3 months. I don't think the court typically spends, years making decisions. They can decide that they're not going to make a decision. And that's something that could happen. There was a potentially landmark case called American Axle versus NIPCO Holdings that came out in 2019 that the Supreme Court agreed to hear, but didn't schedule the actual hearing date right away. They kept it on the docket for 2 full seasons of the court, and then as it became more and more and more controversial, they decided not to hear it at all. My understanding.
But that's on the Supreme Court. You're probably dealing with the district court?
I'm dealing with the federal appellate court for the District of Columbia. So this is pretty literally the second highest court in the land. The only court of appeal from here is the Supreme Court, and this is the court that
can reject the case no matter what.
Yeah. But this is the Court of Appeals for the federal government. So precedence is obviously very important in Anglo jurisprudence, but because of the court district system, sort of has an effect. So if you and I have a disagreement in Virginia, the state that I'm in, and we go to district court and they make a decision that's pretty new and different, that would set a precedent, but that precedent would be relevant in Virginia. And while that precedent could be mentioned in, say, a court in Michigan or California or Texas or New York, courts there could basically say, well, those crazy Virginians, that's what they did, but I think this is what's supposed to happen. And it would be perfectly valid to have sort of multiple situations in different parts of the country. The appellate level would be above the district level, and they control regions of the country. But this is the appellate court that specifically handles the federal government. So their decisions become relevant across all federal departments. And so it's a very powerful court.
Special jurisdiction court, I understand, yeah.
It's sort of like that. There are still the other sort of peer courts that are regional, but this one is very important because, if the California appellate courts say something, the feds don't necessarily have to change the way they work. But if these guys say something, the feds have to change the way that they work, and that has national repercussions.
Great. So we'll see you in 1 year to see what happened. Hopefully you have a decision that's favorable.
Right. Well, yeah, favorable or unfavorable, it may well be memorable. We'll see. Because again, like that, the whole false arrest thing, that's sort of not jocular. They broke their own procedures just to get to this point. I got a notice of acceptance in 2020, which they never rescinded. They just ignored it. I've got a friend locally who's a patent attorney. He dines out on that story when he's at like patent attorney conferences and stuff. Like I know a guy that just had a notice of acceptance ignored. I've talked to dozens of active and retired patent attorneys with some with pretty storied careers. No one I've ever spoken to has ever heard of that happening to anybody. So, we'll see what a federal court thinks about being treated unprecedentedly badly. Can hope for justice, but that's again, it's not up to me.
So thanks for joining me, and I hope to hear something pleasant from you soon. Seems you have a lot of your plate, some nice gestures, and I hope you make it with your commodities market idea. I'm gonna follow you on LinkedIn, so to see whether you succeeded. Hope you post it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And LinkedIn's a pretty good place to follow me. And I'm certain that one way or another, the news will be posted there as it happens.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.